Buenas tardes.
¿Por aquí? Hola. Perfecto, fenomenal. Sí, ¿no? Bien, perfecto. Ah, muy bien. Aquí hay que quitarle el micrófono al colaborate este, ¿no? ¿O no? Sí, ¿no? Compartir el vídeo, eso sí, ¿no? Y este le quitaban si no se acoplaba, no me acuerdo muy bien. Digo, por si quieren tener, me imagino que tendrán un PowerPoint, lo tendremos que colgar aquí. Pero claro, si tenemos esto abierto, ¿qué es lo que pasa? Hola, 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 hola. Suena raro, ¿no? No, suena bien. Si además no va a venir nadie por aquí. Esto es lo que se verá, ¿no?
Sí, efectivamente, eso es lo que se está visualizando
Pero,
por YouTube en este momento.
vale, 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 vale.
Lo mismo está captando todo.
Venga, perfecto. ¿Dónde van a ver ellos? Pondré aquí. La otra.
La pone-
Bueno, vamos a empezar, que ya llevamos mucho retraso y nos deben de estar, bueno, de momento no mucha gente. Espérate, vamos a hacer una cosa, escúchame, porque ese nombre no lo cuelo. Bravo. ¿Se oye bien todo? ¿Más o menos? ¿No repite? Vale, perfecto. Bueno, pues hoy, como vemos también por el público, es la última sesión de este año. Estamos ya un poquito ya a final de curso. Yo he intentado movilizar también a algunos alumnos del grado, pero era un poquito tarde. Pero de todas maneras, está bien. Es simplemente una satisfacción llegar. Y a pesar de las circunstancias y de todo lo que hemos pasado este año, y hemos podido estar trabajando en este espacio, primero con espacio muy restringido, ahora ya lo que nos obligaba a tener todo este sistema, ahora que ya controlamos mejor la tecnología, ya ahora finalmente podemos tener más gente, y es cuando menos gente hay. Pero bueno, no ocurre nada. This afternoon we have with us two colleagues. From University of Padova. They are linked with a research project from the European Research Council, Republic and Risk. The name is Risk, the project you have there. I suppose you are going to speak about. No? The title is The Republics of the States of Kings, Representing Republic and State Power in the European of Absolutist Monarchies. No? It's a very interesting project, really very related with our project. We study Rex Publica about the Spanish monarchy as a composite structure, imperial structure of urban republics. So we have a strong dialogue. We have a first meeting during the pandemic, absolutely all online, a seminar titled Questioning Republics in Early Modern Genoa in December 2020. And we begin to have a strong collaboration. We are going to have another seminar now in Padova in May with people from the two project. The analysis of them, I think you are going to explain better than me, is a multidisciplinary campus of sources now, because there is a dialogue between literature studies, cultural studies, intellectual art studies, history, and also the objective is to find a kind of alternative genealogy of absolutism and putting the role of the republics in this dialogue with the monarchies. So something really related with the thing we are doing. No, the next activity you are preparing is something about Tacito alla lettera. No, is the study of the citation of Tacito in the political literature in the 17th century. Is going to be in February 2022. And okay, now we are going to begin with one of the members of this seminar. We have decided it's so related the two parts of the seminar, so we are going to take both presentation at the beginning. After we are going to have a break, and after we are going to have all the discussion, because it's a case study related with a general topic. They are going to to present something really linked. No, Enrico Zucchi did his PhD in the University of Padova in 2017. And he's a specialist in 17th and 18th European theater, and also in the Accademia dell'Arcadia. You have wrote something. He passed some period in Université Sorbonne Paris 4 with a group of history of théâtre, and histoire du théâtre comparé à l'époque moderne, choses comme ça. And he have write a lot of paper related with these things. No, I think you are going to present something. Yes, is going to be published recently. I suppose a Republican in comparison. I know this article in History of European Ideas is comparison between the case study you study in the Risk project. No, is Venice, Genoa, Lucca, Ragusa, and also the Dutch Republic. And you have other papers I don't going to speak about. And you have the floor, Enrico, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you all for the wonderful presentation, for the very warm welcoming. Thank you very much. I will dive immediately into the subject. The first question from which I moved when I started working on the culture of 17th century Republic of Genoa, once I became a member of the Risk project, my topic is specifically the Republic of Genoa. The first question was this: what we think about when we think about early modern republicanism. When you approach such an issue from a scholarly perspective, it is almost impossible that the first books you handle, the first ideas that comes to your mind, are not those spread by the Cambridge School of Intellectual History. Books such as Pocock, The Machiavellian Moment, or Quentin Skinner's Liberty Before Liberalism, published in the last 30 years and drawn in dozens of volumes and articles by historians of the Renaissance political thought, have deeply colonized our mind to the extent that when we think about early modern republicanism, we imagine a shared European heritage as the subtitle of a book published in 2005. In the opinion of several scholars, republicanism is a long-lasting political tradition based on a strict set of well-defined political ideas, which includes, for instance, the claim for unconditioned liberty and the radical hostility to the monarchical constitution, established in the 5th century Athens, then inherited in the Republican Rome, and assumed in Machiavelli Florence, Cromwell's England, and in the Constitution of the United States. The aim of these scholars was that of demonstrating that extraordinary resilience of this Republican project, prior and stronger than those of liberalism or absolutism. Yet, this fascinating idea of a tough and durable political tradition that survives almost continuously identical from the ancient Greece to the French Revolution, argued mostly in reference to two limited case studies, that of Soderini's Florence and of Milton's London, appears far less convincing when we deal with a variety of texts produced in 16th and 17th century Italian republics. Some scholars in recent years, following also the suggestion of Franco Venturi, yesterday we talked about this a little bit, some scholars in recent years, following also the suggestion of Franco Venturi, have questioned the worth of Pocock's and Skinner's vision. Gabriele Pedulla, for example, a literary scholar whose research focused on 15th and 16th century Florence, has pointed out that as far as the Florentine case is concerned, the historians belonging to the Cambridge School have forced the medieval and Renaissance text into an over-modernizing conceptual framework, showing how, in fact, Florentine political ideas in those years are characterized by a weak republicanism, very different from the strong republican theory that will emerge only later. Manuel Herrero Sanchez and you all, historians at the Universidad Pablo Olavide in Sevilla, have demonstrated that it doesn't exist a concrete ideological conflict between monarchies and republics in the early modern Europe, to the point that the Spanish Empire seems a sort of monarchical republic, wherein the sovereignty is fragmented and polycentric. Following this trail, I've tried in these years to survey Genoese, but also Dutch and Venetian 17th century political literature in relation to three cornerstones of the interpretative path of Cambridge republicanism, that are the total ideological contrast to the monarchical constitution, the claim for radical liberty, according to which every form of subjectitude is equivalent to servitude, the exclusive drawing of ancient Roman authors as political models. In my paper, I will try to discuss some case studies that I've examined in this year in order to prove that the early modern political culture is far less black and white than that described by the Cambridge School. That Genoese political thought generally was not anti-monarchical at all, that 17th century political works produced in Republican context were deeply influenced by early modern sources, much more than ancient ones, and that often these sources conveyed absolutist ideas. The very first element that led us to question the idea of a strong, deeply rooted ideological contrast to the monarchical government in 17th century Italian republics is located in the Republican constitution themselves. It seems very hard to argue that Genoa, Venice, or Amsterdam even are characterized by a fervent harvest at hatred towards the absolutist state, when their constitution introduced on purpose figures that belong to the royal policy. Gasparo Contarini, de Magistratibus et Republica Venetorum, argued that the strength of the Venetian political system resided in the fact that it was mixed, requiring a democratic component, the Maggior Consiglio, an aristocratic element, that of the consigli and other delegates, and a monarchical one, the Doge. In the Dutch federal system, where the States General ruled in agreement with the Prince Stadtholder, this compresence of a monarchical compound constitutionally established appears even more evident. The cases of Genoa and Venice are, of course, much different from that of Florence and London, since we are not dealing with newborn republics created after a revolution against the previous king, but with older and more complex political entities that had a long history behind them. But the fact is that when people in 16th and 17th century referred to contemporary republics, they have more often in mind Venice and Genoa, and later the United Province, much more than Florence or London, which were republics just for a little period. And it is a little bit anachronistic to think that Machiavelli's Florence was the emblem of Renaissance Republic only because some of the political theories there spread were maybe ideologically more alike to a post-French Revolution democracy. But after this general consideration, let me take a closer look at the genuine 17th century political culture, examining the circulation of books that supported the idea according to which monarchy was the best form of government. We understand that Genoa was not anti-monarchical at all. On the contrary, the Doge and other eminent protagonists of the Republican life promoted the translation and the publication of several absolutist treatises. In 1588 appeared in Genoa the Italian translation of Jean Baudin's 6 Livres de la République, maybe the most representative book of 16th century absolutist political theory, made by Lorenzo Conti with an official dedication to the Doge Davide Vacca. This was the first translation ever of the work of Baudin that had been just published a dozen of years before, 1576. In the dedication, Conti, rather than underlining that Baudin's predilection for the absolute monarchy is contrary to the Republican culture, celebrates the sharpness of the French writer and considers the book particularly useful to a Doge. In his opinion, the Republic of Genoa seems not so different to the French kingdom. It is still a princedom, but even more refined since its leader, like you can see in the extract, is not chosen by the fate, as it happens for a prince of blood, but elected by his fellow citizens. In the same years, another eminent citizen of the Republic of Genoa, Ambrogio Spinola, who was still at that time a very relevant politician of his homeland, promoted the translation of 2 other absolutist treatises. I am alluding to Philippe de Comines' memoir, published in the Italian version in 1594, and to Pedro de Ribadeneira's Tratado de la Religión y virtudes que debe tener el príncipe cristiano para gobernar y conservar sus estados. Published in Genoa in Italian in 1598, only 3 years after the Spanish Princeps. Both the two works share a clear absolutist view, since the first is a description of the heroic deeds of the French king Louis XIV, and the second is a sort of Christian rephrasing of Machiavelli's Prince. In a few words, the translation and circulation of these kinds of works prove the curiosity of the Genoese political elites toward the absolutist literature, rather than testifying the clear-cut otherness to the monarchical culture of the Genoese republicanism. Nobody at that time had the belief that those treatises were not suitable for a republican policy such as Genoa. These 3 were just books that gave concrete insights on the contemporary political government, so they were very useful, much more than the history of Livy, wrote Conti in his Dedication, for the contemporary ruling class of each sort of policy. Apart from the translation, the 17th century Genoa proved its interest toward these books, supporting an absolutist culture also in other ways, such as the book collecting. Thanks to the works of some literary historians and bibliographers, we can now affirm that one of the best sellers of the time that could not be left over the libraries of the most powerful Genoese patricians was Lipsius' Politicorum Libris Sex. In the political work of Lipsius, monarchy was considered with no doubt the best policy, much more well-structured and fairer than the Republic. Still, in Genoa, where lived for a while Peter Paul Rubens, Lipsius' pupil, it was commonly read and appreciated. We can even find some extracts of the Politicorum in the 1589 print that included 1 year later in the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, instantly translated by Lorenzo Conti in his version of Comines Memoir. Moreover, entering on the field of diplomacy and of political representation so well explored by your research group, 17th century Italian republics were not so reluctant to exhibit, together with their republican status, also a sort of royal aura. Actually, they strove to represent themselves as monarchies. In the scenario of the Baroque Europe, the stage of kings, as Alessandro named it while elaborating the RISC project, the small republics of Genoa and Venice pretended to be constitutionally identical to the great European absolutist regime in order to gain prestige and not to have the worst position in the diplomatic order of precedence according to the 17th century ceremonial. It was not only a matter of form. Without the claim for royal possession outside the territorial domain of the Republic, they were not considered actors of the European diplomatic agenda. For this reason, Venice vigorously defended the possession of little reigns in the Mediterranean. The War of Candia bravely fought against the much stronger Turkish enemy with a disproportionate expenditure, was not battled only to maintain a little possession in the fair Isle of Crete. The royal status of Venice was at stake. Still, in the dedication to the Doge of the time, Giovanni Pesaro, of Galeazzo Gualdo Prioratos, Scena d'Uomini Illustri, a volume containing literary portraits of great Italian captains, politicians, and writers, published at the age of the War of Candia, 1659, there are several allusions to the royal status of Venice. Here, the Doge is described as a crowned head. His behavior appears nothing less than regal, and Venice is defined a princedom. I have highlighted some words that testifies the monarchical, the absolutist vocabulary. Public majesty, the splendor, the majesty, the prudence, the clemency, the crown, the princedom, the father. All attributes referred to the Doge. Something very similar appeared in those years in Genoa, a little bit earlier, we are 1630, 1640, in Genoa, that was often represented as a sort of Christian monarchy ruled by the Virgin Mary, considered the Queen of Genoa. But this issue was not only an artistic topos reproduced by several painters and sculptors, such as Domenico Fiasella. Here you have a couple of examples. It also entailed a precise political claim. So let's go to the second point of my paper, the claim for radical liberty. Quentin Skinner, in his important book, Liberty Before Liberalism, dealing with the English Republic of Cromwell during the Interregnum, stated that republicanism was characterized by the claim for unlimited liberty. According to Skinner, recalling themselves to some juridical and historical ancient sources, such as the Roman Digest and, again, Livy's historiography, 17th century English authors elaborated a radical interpretation of liberty within republican state, defining liberty in opposition to the concept of slavery. In the Roman sources and in the books of Harrington and his contemporary, every limitation of personal liberty, Skinner assumes, is a sort of slavery. So, republic is the only form of government where there is freedom, there is liberty, because there are no subjects. In order to support his thesis, Skinner mentions an exchange between Thomas Hobbes and James Harrington. This exchange was focused on the concept of liberty. According to Thomas Hobbes, a citizen of the small republic of Lucca could not claim to have more liberty than a subject of the Constantinople Sultan, since what counted was not the source of liberty that came from a king or from a republican senate, but its extension. And to the Turkish citizens, it was allowed to do pretty the same things that a citizen of Lucca could do. Harrington, on the contrary, argued that the poorest citizen of the Lucca Republic had far more liberty than the Constantinople's Pasha, the second highest imperial leader, since this one, the last one, the Pasha, living in a monarchy, was subject of a king that could do whatever he wanted with his subordinates. However, in 17th century Venice and Genoa, it is very difficult to find analogous expression and a similar drastic wish for absolute liberty. These two Italian republics were commonly considered at the time a sort of aristocracy or oligarchies, wherein the liberty was not universal and without restrictions. This excerpt, taken from Tommaso Campanella's Discorsi della Libertà, well defines what the republican liberty was considered at the time. Here Campanella has the clear perception that the Aristotelian and Neo-Roman liberty has nothing in common with the republican liberty of policy such as the contemporary Genoa or Venice, where slavery was not banished at all. It is very clear in Campanella's view, you can see it from this excerpt, that Genoa and Venice were ruled by a small elite and a large part of the citizens were their subjects. What Genoese early modern authors intend when they refer to liberty seems instead something notably different from the absolute individual liberty, or better, the absence of restrictions to personal freedom. The liberty they claim for their republic, the liberty they celebrate in Genoa, is the autonomy from the other foreign powers. The history of medieval and early modern Genoa, and you of course know this very well, is full of tensions with the neighboring monarchies. The life of the republic passed always through a negotiation of its autonomy, of its independence with this more powerful political entity. Already in the Middle Ages, Genoa had ambiguous relationship with the Holy Roman Empire, and thanks to the ability of its diplomacy, it succeeded to obtain a privileged political status, preserving its liberty, that is to say, its autonomy. Marie-Louise Farolilly described the 14th and 15th century Genoa in this term. It was de jure an imperial city, but de facto it was almost completely devoid of obligation. Even during the reign of Charles V in the 16th century, thanks to the precious work of Andrea Doria, Genoa managed to preserve its liberty. It was, as suggested by Matthias Schnettger, a civitas imperialis, somehow formally part of the empire, and by virtue of this status secured from the expansionistic aim of the French reign, but it held back its autonomy, its liberty. In the 17th century, when Genoese politicians or men of letters evoke the concept of liberty, they almost always allude to the independency from interference of foreign monarchies in the republican political life. Ansaldo Cebà, Il cittadino di Repubblica, a political treatise published in 1617 by one of the most appreciated Genoese authors of his time, very close to the Spinoza's family and to the Republicistas party, the political faction whose program was characterized by the strong claim for political autonomy, argues that in order to preserve its liberty, Genoa should be free from the political influences of both the Spanish and the French monarchies. This is liberty for Genoa. The perfect republican citizen, according to Cebà, is the one who struggles for his homeland's political independence. In his work that maybe presents the most radical political vision at that time, we cannot find any allusion to a liberty intended as a complete individual emancipation from authority, or even as the total lack of obligation due to the subjecthood. Even in another pamphlet that assumed a very critical position against the Genoese Republican government, titled Le malattie politiche della Repubblica di Genova, written by Gaspare Squarciafico, a Genoese nobleman sentenced to exile for political reasons, the idea of liberty displayed is pretty the same. According to his metaphorical diagnosis of the political body of the Republic, Genoa's illnesses that led it at that time almost at the point of death were caused by the lack of liberty due to the strict and ambiguous relationships with the two powerful neighboring monarchies. Another detractor of the Genoese political strategy, Pietro Pomo, official historiographer at the court of Ferdinand III in Vienna, mocked the pretended liberty, that means, again, political autonomy of the Republic of Genoa, and said that its difficult balancing in foreign policy in fact made it slave of two opposite monarchies. Con ostentazione di libertà serve ad ambedue. In Pomo's words, we can find again the conflict between liberty and servitude evoked by Harrington. But this contrast is not centered on individual liberty, but on political independence from other policies. The personal subjecthood is never at stake, since Genoese citizens commonly admitted to be subject, at best, of the Genoese Senate, at worst, of Spanish or French Empire. And so, let's pass to the last point, the last of the 3 points here examined that concerns the choice of sources. According to these scholars, to the Cambridge scholars, early modern republicanism is based on the drone of Aristotelian ideas or of the Roman authors, such as an interpretative scheme has been often referred also to the Genoese and Venetian Renaissance text, particularly stressing the aim of this republic to represent themselves as the legitimate modern heir of the classical Athens or of the ancient republican Rome. As far as the Genoese case is concerned, some scholars pointed out that the political treatise published within the borders of the Ligurian Republic in the first decades of the 17th century continued to raise issues drawn by Plutarch, Livy, Sallust, and Cicero. Ceba, il cittadino di Repubblica, according to their view, with its nostalgic classicism, is a perfect sample of this neo-Roman political theory, since it contains several allusions to these ancient authors, and it does not, they say, take any original position or make any reference to early modern political theories. What these scholars assume is that there were 2 different opposite traditions of political thought that had nothing in common. The first was the Republican one, based on the celebration of Aristotelian or Roman virtue and on the drone of ancient sources. The other was the absolutist one, based on the principle of the reason of state and derived from 16th and 17th century political treatises. Unfortunately, this black and white scenario is a critical anachronistic simplification that do not correspond to the political culture of the early modern period. If we look thoroughly at Ceba's treatise, for example, it's easy to get that the quotation from the Latin sources often hide a second and more precise reference to a modern author, very well known in Genoa at that time, whose work was based on the quotation and commentary of ancient sources. And I'm alluding, of course, to Lipsius and his Politicorum Libris Sex. The prototype of the perfect republican citizen shaped in Ceba's book perfectly matches with the portrait of the ideal sovereign sketched out by Lipsius in his volume. For both of them, the final aim of their political action is to achieve the common good. Both of them should be directed in their activism by the same values that are justice, clemency, and modesty. They both have to be generous with their own money in favor of the collectivity, but without being wasteful. They both have to keep well away from the extreme parsimony. They both should have a humanistic education, know well ancient and modern history and philosophy, read poetry, speak or at least understand several foreign idioms. Mostly, they both have to take obsessively care of their individual reputation that should be perfectly clean, since they need to collect the general and enthusiastic consensus of subjects and citizens. As it can be easily argued, more than listing a series of virtues taken from Latin historiography, Ceba, who read well Lipsius' work, is here modeling his republican citizen on the description of the perfect prince made by the Dutch writer. Virtues such as clemency and magnificence indeed did not belong to the ancient republican tradition. They are part of the absolutist early modern pantheon of qualities demanded to the king. And it is very remarkable the fact that Cheba requires to his republican citizen those assets. This is, according to my opinion, the clear evidence that early modern republican culture normally derived portion of its political discourse from the absolutist imagery. And consequently, the highly compartmentalized representation of the two different cultures, conflictual and never in contact, turns out to be mistaken. I have almost concluded. Many other signs of hybridation of contemporary absolutist writing in Republican 17th century works can be found also looking outside the Genoese case. If we look at Venice, we can find a deep penetration, for example, of Hobbes' thesis in several 17th century political texts. Let us examine, for example, the already mentioned dedication of Gualdo Priorato's Scena d'Uomini Illustri to the Doge Pesari. Here, the entire Venetian political body, the whole assembly of common people and patricians, is identified with the head of the Doge, whose will naturally mirrors that of his people, quanta gran parte risegga nel loro che è il medesimo che dire nel vostro capo. It is hard to find, even in a monarchical contemporary context, a more evident allusion to one of the central ideas of the Leviathan. In conclusion, what emerges from this survey is that the categories established by the Cambridge School of Intellectual History to read the European phenomenon of early modern republicanism are not suitable to interpret correctly the political culture of republics such as Genoa or Venice. The Genoese case is very peculiar, it's true, because of some geopolitical causes that cannot be overlooked while examining the political production of the time. It was historically linked to great absolutist policies, being first a civitas imperialis during the Holy Roman Empire, and then a peripheric center of the polycentric Spanish monarchy. But if we want to examine the Genoese, maybe also the Venetian case, juxta propria principia, we have first to admit that early modern republicanism was a very complex phenomenon that can be hardly reduced to an homologating formula. In this period, Italian republics are continuously negotiating their identity, which is for sure a weak identity, to the extent that in the second part of the 17th century, when the absolutism was dominant in Europe, they consider strengthening the monarchical component of their constitution, as I have showed in a previous article recently published and mentioned very kindly also by Manuel on the journal History of European Ideas. Here you can find other articles that are already published or almost published in press. If you need something, if you are interested also in have the draft copy, please write me. I will be very glad to send you all this material. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrico, for the presentation. And now we are going to hear the presentation of Alessandro Metrica. He's the IP of this project, RISC, and is an associate professor of the comparative literature in Department of Linguistics and Literature Studies in Padua University. He passed some period in Louvain-la-Neuve University as Marie Curie, but also you have also other kind of contract there. And your research focus is related with the representation of power, in early modern period, and you have done two critical editions, one of Ferrante Pallavicino and another of Giobattista Casti. And okay, you analyze the ritualization of power in a pan-European scale, analysis of the Pope space, Russia also, Habsburg monarchy, and France, and recently you published a book, La seduzione della pace, Giobattista Marino, le feste di corte nella Francia barocca. And recently you have prepared also, I have seen, together a monograph in Quaderni Veneti, is something related with that. And okay, in relation with, I think, Enrico has introduced, you are going to speak, if I know in a mistake, in the Venice case. Thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this presentation, but not only. I would like to thank you, Manuel, and thanks to you all for the warm welcoming. It's really nice to be here. I'm very glad that this collaboration is being developed, and I look also further for other collaboration as well. But, well, today I'm here. I would like to reaffirm the general framework of our project, which Enrico just presented brilliantly. And I would like to do this by adding another element to this framework, which is chronology. Indeed, I think that Enrico's presentations offered a comprehensive overview of risks, the project, methodological ambitions, especially with regard to the shift that we envisage from intellectual to cultural history. And I would like to clarify our work method by illustrating in further details our corpus of sources, which is made for the most part, as has been shown, by literary and artistic representations. I worked in literary studies, but of course, if I'm here today, there is a reason, as I hope to show you. To achieve such goal, I moved to another political context. Actually, we already talked, it has already been mentioned, which is my main field of expertise right now, the Republic of Venice. Beside, I'm just talking of a single case study, which is the entry of the procurators of St. Mark. This ceremony, belonging to the field of Venetian civic ritual, played a key role not only in political, but also in cultural terms, for it involved performative gestures, ephemeral works of art, and encomiastic publications. In the past month, I worked on this case study extensively in order to submit a couple of papers for 2 Brill volumes, but since these books have not been published yet, at least the second, this is the first time that I actually present my results, and I count on your remarks and suggestions then to improve this contribution. Like this. Yes. So, well-renowned and much celebrated throughout Europe, Venetian political rituality has been copiously served by literature as well. The classic book by Edward Muir and the more recent monograph by Ian Fenlon, you see the 2 covers in my slide, stand out among many other contributions on the topic. However, the ceremony that I consider, the entry of the procurators of St. Mark, has been neglected almost completely so far. As I argue in my presentation, this is due precisely to the scholarly paradigm that Enrico has just discussed. By framing the Republican ritual in a supposedly unchanging tradition, which would have kept the same cultural references and performative etiquette in the name of a rather abstract concept of republicanism, scholars did not examine what happened in Venice after the pretended golden age of the Republic, covering the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Actually, most researchers seem to believe that such exam was simply unnecessary, because they assumed given the consistency and the resilience of the Republican paradigm, that the social and political meanings associated to it cannot evolve nor be modified. Of course, this idea is not groundless per se, as a solid foundation in the sources instead, especially because the Serenissima itself created it and promoted it. I refer to what has been called the Myth of Venice. Besides inspiring a sophisticated, multi-layered oligarchical government in which power was distributed between a multitude of short-time offices, in Venice, republicanism fed a system of symbols, or, in the words of Fallon, that I quoted before, an accumulation of inherited beliefs and meanings, which offered a self-portrait of the ruling elite, the Venetian patriciate. Values and ideas as diverse as faith, devotion, liberty, and constitutional balance merged in this myth, which could be seen, as James Grubb argues, as a mix of historical explanation and contingent propaganda. A city blessed by God and protected by St. Mark, whose body was brought in the lagoon in 828, Venice boasted of having enjoyed an undisputed liberty since its foundation, and this claim became even more distinctive in the 16th century in a Europe dominated by kingdoms and empires. Works like Gasparo Contarini's De Magistratibus Republica Venetorum, we already talked of this, and Donato Giannotti's La Repubblica dei Veneziani celebrated a unique constitution guaranteeing the perfect balance between monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. This myth famously led John Pocock, one of the most distinguished members of the so-called Cambridge School, to speak with regard to Contarini's model of a mechanization of virtue. In a state regulated so severely by accurate laws, ethics and politics seem to transform in a clockwork device. Oh, come on. I had a nice effort here, but it has been spoiled by the passage. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Of course, if where is Wally? Now I'm explaining it. No, don't worry. Civic ritual played a substantial part within the myth of Venice. The sovereignty of the Republic was staged through a series of highly codified performances according to a tight agenda that combined secular and liturgical events. Processions held on a religious occurrence, festivities celebrating a key historical date, receptions welcoming foreign guests, elections, popular games, and regattas helped to visualize the power of the state and Republican ideology. During the solemn parades that crossed St. Mark's Square, for example, the symbols of Venetian power and independence, the so-called trionfi dogali, were exhibited. Now we are coming to Wally. While accomplishing civic rituals, the presence of the Doge, the Prince of the Republic, as it was called, was fundamental. However, his figure, and this is clearly true, was not important per se. Indeed, Republican ritual did not pivot on the body of the Doge as French Sacre did with the king's body. Of course, we all have read Kantorowicz sooner or later. The Doge rather personifies the body politic of the patriciate as a whole, and in this respect, Venetian civic ritual was not designed to celebrate a single ruler, but an oligarchical ruling class instead. This is the reason why, in the famous painting by Gentile Bellini that you have on the screen, as well and in many other teleri representing Venetian civic ritual, if you want to find the Doge, you have to play to Where is Wally? You see the little circle in white, the Doge is there. It's really hard, it's really difficult to see him if you don't know. So the same goes for very famous rituals like the Feast of the Ascension, the Sensa, when the Doge sailed to open sea and symbolically married the Adriatic Sea by dropping a golden ring into the water. Now, these rituals, including the role the Doge played in them, have been widely studied. So there's a ton of literature about that. But I think that a major issue arises when considering such literature. Scholars, once again, have focused almost exclusively on the centuries when the power of Venice was at its peak. Even if the Republic was fully independent until 1797, when it fell at the hands of Napoleon, no comprehensive analysis has been dedicated to Venetian civic ritual with regard to the 17th and the 18th century. Therefore, according to the most influential studies on the topic, in these 200 years, the patriciate would have simply preserved the tradition of the myth as if any major change made to it was unbearable. And this is really interesting for our working hypothesis, because as Enrico said, and I didn't know that you were saying this at the end of your presentation, but it's perfect. Of course, in the 17th century, the problem concerning monarchical representation is more present than ever. And so we have a lot of studies about 16th century when Venice is at the peak of its power, but we know very little about the relationship with the monarchical representation in the next 2 centuries, which are the most interesting time frame, in my opinion, to analyze such hybridization. You use this word, and I make it mine, as I often do with your ideas. I assume, on the contrary, that there was a metamorphosis in 17th century Venetian pageantry, and I argue that this new representation of power hinged on a new social basis. And this is the historical part, I think, of my presentation. Indeed, this shift in the representation of patriciate is primarily due to the power relationship within the estate itself, which radically changed after the end of the Renaissance. The economic and political crisis affecting Venice in the 17th century, culminating in the Ottoman-Venetian wars of Candia and Morea, Crete and Peloponnese, made the contrast between rich and poor noblemen way deeper. Although nominally equal in rights and power, the two parties had increasingly different prerogatives, depending on the private fortune of their houses, the casate. This process within the patriciate affected the myth as well. According to the myth, the patriciate was an estate without internal contrasts, so that the decisions it took were highly coherent and almost mechanized. Starting in the 1630s, however, the most wealthy and powerful patricians openly challenged this vision, as they claimed a new protagonism both in politics and culture, from poetry to architecture. Several collections of eulogies were printed, glorifying this or that patrician with words and metaphors foreign to the Republican tradition. And churches arose with facades adorned by the portraits of the patrons in place of angels and saints. Sculptures portraying political leaders of the Serenissima, which were extremely rare before the 1620s, now appeared in squares, churches, and private palaces. And a good example, which had been studied by Matteo Casini, is one of the few contributions on this, are sea captains, because their military role obviously stood out during Candia and Morea wars. The ceremony of the entry of the procurators of St. Mark, so apparently a minor ceremony which has been neglected so far, mirrors with all evidence such process towards a new individualism within the Republican sphere. First of all, it should be noted that the appointment of a new procurator was one of the most significant political events in Venice, as top-ranked magistrates in charge of the church, treasury, and legacy of St. Mark's Basilica, the Procuratori held the most prestigious office in the Republic after that of Doge. And just like the Doge, unlike all other Venetian offices, Procuratori were appointed for life. most of the doge themselves were selected among the procurators. The office had a long history, was created in the 11th century and had grown long since, both in number, from 2 to 9 members, and in power. For the Procuratore had accumulated more responsibilities throughout the 15th and the 16th century. Besides the upkeep of the Basilica and the Piazza area, where they were entitled to private accommodations in the Procuratie, procurators distributed alms, took care of orphans, executed wills, and administrated perpetual trusts made by private testators. Their financial duties granted the Procuratore a large influence over the Venetian economy and money markets, and even if the sway they exerted on politics was to some extent limited, they certainly were among the most powerful men of Venice. Now, I don't quote these sources from 17th and 18th century, but I want to say that as testified by these sources that you can see on the screen, the Procuratore played a major role within 17th century Venetian rituality as well. The most ritualized moment in their career was their election. The entry of a new member gave rise to various celebrations throughout the city. When the news of the election broke, bells rang for 3 days in celebration, drums and trumpets sounded in the streets, as the new elected handed out wine, bread, and money near the traghetti, the ferry stops. By night, churches and buildings were decorated with lamps, and there were fireworks in many parts of the city. After these 3 days rejoicings, the actual entry was scheduled. The ceremony could be held a few days as well as several months later, because procurators could be away from Venice as ambassadors, for example. The performance was at once physical and symbolic. The day the Procuratore officially started its office, he also received the keys to the new apartments on the piazza. Hence, his entry into service matched his entry to the Procuratie Palace. Although we have very few images of how the entry actually took place, in this respect, the painting by Gabriel Bella that you have on the screen is almost unique. Our printed sources describe the ceremony in details, and I'm sorry if I have to be very specific, but this is going to be important, as you will see. On the appointed day, friends and relatives picked up the newly elected procurator in front of his house and took him by boat at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi near the Rialto on the Grand Canal. Here, the group landed to reach the nearby church of San Salvador. A first solemn mass was celebrated, allowing the crowd to gather. Afterwards, the Procuratore left San Salvador in the middle of an imposing procession consisting of up to 500 or 600 people, and including servants and foreigners, musicians and soldiers, as well as the other procurators and a large part of the Senate. Bella's painting, which is set in front of San Salvador, portrays this very scene. Arranged in pairs, the cortege marched past the Mercerie, the streets where the most refined shops in Venice were, and paraded from the Rialto to St. Mark's Square. Another mass was celebrated in St. Mark's Basilica, and here there was another ritual. The procurator stepped to the altar, swore a personal oath, and finally received the keys to the office. In the end, people having marched with the newly elected procurator from San Salvador to San Mark either received 4 pani di zuccheri, they are some Venetian sweets, as a gift, or joined the banquet that ended the celebrations. I think that this has been studied only by an historian of art that I know, Paolo De Lorenzi, because indeed the artistic side of the ceremony was really important. Lavish decorations adorned the ceremonial route, which was transfigured by ephemeral arches and architectures adorned bearing the coat of arms of the Procuratore's family. The Campo of San Salvador, once again the same depicted by Bella, was filled with priceless tapestries, and the surrounding streets and alleys, as well as the Rialto Bridge, were peppered with festoons. Persian drapes hung from the windows, and several paintings, including allegorical compositions and portraits of the elected, were exhibited along the path taken by the processions. The shops on the Mercerie played a main role too, because the owners put their most polished items on display. Gems, pearls, mirrors, rare feathers, and precious fabrics were arranged to compose the procurator's crest or his name. Sumptuous laceworks, decorated in gold and silver, were placed next to the engravings with his portrait, which many shops displayed in the window. These ephemeral decorations included even literature. Like the engraved portraits of the procurator, printed sheets with sonnets and other eulogies hung on the walls or were distributed among the crowd attending the entry. Storekeepers on the Mercerie showcased such texts as if they were a rare merchandise. As far as our working hypothesis is concerned, and this is the part that this is the work I made because these texts were completely neglected before, the most interesting part of this literary production concerns a rather peculiar genre, the festival book. Indeed, on the occasion of the entry, texts were printed describing the ceremony, interpreting the allegories on display, and celebrating the virtues of both the procuratore and his casata. These festival books aimed at reflecting the ceremony, at representing the entry in the sense of presenting it again, and even in recreating it for the reader. In doing so, they intended first and foremost to honor the procurator, to whom the volume was, of course, dedicated. Therefore, by publishing these texts, authors pursued a form of individual celebration. Now, I finally come to the point I announced at the beginning, chronology. In fact, the most surprising data emerging from a study of these books is this. In the 35 years of the Morea War, that is between 1684 and 1718, this literary production was massive. A preliminary survey, far from being exhaustive, numbers among the works printed for the entry of a procuratore 21 texts. Festival books, but also books of poetry, orations, and panegyrics. Beside the accounts in the Gazette, we have dozens of these. The publication rate, you cannot see this, but please believe me, the publication rate is even higher in the 18th century, and we have more or less a book each year. But was this an actual tradition in the Republic of Venice? Was the entry of the procurators a codified part of the myth of the Serenissima? Printed sources tell a different story. Before the 1680s, books celebrating a single procurator were very, very rare. Just one book before 1650. Moreover, and this is the most interesting part I discovered by studying this text, the shift in terms of publications mirrors a surprising difference in ritual. Throughout the 16th century, and at least until the 1630s, the entry of the procurator of St. Mark was not only lacking a paper celebration in typography, but was also much more modest in itself. Not only had the performance less relevance, but even the route traveled by the procession was not the same. To follow the evolution of the ceremony, we can lean on the famous work by Francesco Sansovino, Venezia, città nobilissima e singolare. This sort of touristic guide avant la lettre, describing the most distinguished palaces, institutions, and festivities in Venice, was first published in 1581. Due to the large success of the book, however, a couple of up-to-date versions were published in the 17th century, adding to the original account subsequent events and new information. Thus, Sansovino's Venezia was reissued by Giovanni Stringa in 1604 and by Giustiniano Martignoni in 1663. So 2 up-to-date versions in the 17th century. The original version from 1581 is very frequently quoted as the main text on the rejoicings that followed the election of a procuratore. But Sansovino's account is not very detailed, especially because it does not mention the entry, but just the 3-day rejoicings that happened before it. And even the 3-day rejoicing seems to be a marginal issue compared to the historical origins and duties of the office. As evidence of this, Sansovino deals with the procurators in Book 7 on public palaces, rather than in Book 10 on city clothes, customs, and habits. Venetian ceremonies, such as the spectacular festivals organized to welcome foreign kings and princes, are described in Book 10, while the rejoicing for the procurators are quickly evoked in Book 7. We are discussing the procuratie, the palace on the piazza. We are not talking of the civic ritual. Apparently then, the entry of the procurator of St. Mark was not a crucial matter in 16th century Venice, as far as civic ritual was concerned. And testament to this are also some other pages that Sansovino devotes precisely in Book 10 to the festivities held after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Here we have the Rialto papered and covered with festoons. We have paintings hanging on the mercerie. We have the goods exhibited by the storekeepers. All elements that clearly point to the future ritual, but the entry of the procurators has nothing to do with this. It's a public rejoicing for the victory of Lepanto. It's not a private election of a single patrician. This does not mean that the ceremony of the entry did not exist in the 16th century. The reedition of Venezia, edited by Stringa, you see the second version from 1604, feels compelled to fill the gap by adding a description of the procession as it was performed already in Sansovino's times. However, the event looks quite different from the one reported in the later sources that I have already mentioned. Firstly, the order of magnitude is different. About 300 people, and not 500 or 600, attended the processions, and at the end, 2 and not 4 pani di zucchero were given. Secondly, and more importantly, the ceremonial route was not only sensibly shorter, but also radically dissimilar. For the parade started from the church of San Moisè instead of from San Salvador, and it did not include the mercerie. Google is saying that we have a 4-minute walk against a 14-minute walk. But I think that the mercerie are really the main point at stake here, because during the 16th century, the mercerie were already the most famous streets in Venice, and many cardinals and ambassadors explicitly asked the Venetian authorities to visit the shops, which were at the heart of European luxury market. Still, the street had a secondary role in the framework of civic ritual as far as the procurators of St. Mark are concerned, and it was used only for special occasions like after Lepanto. And as the route from San Moisè and St. Mark is a straighter way to the Basilica with almost no shops on it, it can be assumed that at that time, in Sansovino's time, the profusion of ephemeral decorations and the exhibitions of luxurious goods weren't deemed mandatory to execute the ritual. Although most of the literature did not notice the change of route, this is clearly indicated in the third and last reedition of Venezia. Sorry, I changed a little bit too early. Martignoni adds a new paragraph explaining that senators and procurators, and here I translate a quote from the original text, do not gather anymore in the church of San Moisè, like Stringa said, but in the church of San Salvador. And this slide was simply to show you that we can assign a more accurate date to the substitution, which happened shortly after the plague of 1631. Indeed, the first document attesting that San Salvador was papered for the entry of procurator dates back to the election of Francesco Molin in 1634. And this new itinerary was quickly codified. In 1641, this was the route the procession took, and the first festival book, entirely devoted to the entry of a procuratore, appeared. 1641, the elected is Giovanni Pesaro, later Doge, the same to whom the dedication by Gualdo Priorato was directed, and the one really arguing that Venezia has to keep Candia, Crete, because it was a kingdom and Venice needed the royal authorities coming from the possession of Candia. I try to move to my conclusion, but I still have 5 minutes maybe?
Yeah.
The expansion of the ceremony, because it's not Enrico Zucchi, it's Andrea Zucchi. That's why you're laughing. The expansion of the ceremony of the entry in the central decades of the 16th century has very little to do with the image of the Venetian patriciate as a concordant and communal body politic. Instead, it seems to be connected with a new individualism, which target magnificence as means for a celebration of either self or family. The massive expenditure staged on the mercerie aimed to project the exceptional status of the few houses that could afford such spectacle. In this respect, it should be noted that in the period considered, a very rich man could also buy his access to the College of Procurators. While there were only 9 procuratori by merit, per merito, additional positions were on sale for 20,000 ducats. But the sale of the office was an exceptional measure taken to finance the state treasury. It has been taken very, very rarely in the 16th century, exclusively in troubled times, right before Lepanto, for example, and for few men. But the rising costs of the wars of Candia and Morea persuaded the Senate to adopt this measure on several occasions in the 17th century, and respectively 41 Candia and 24 Morea procurators by means per mezzi were elected. This measure echoed the one taken in 1646, which was even more radical. For the first time after 1297, the patriciate welcomed into its ranks some new families, as long as they could pay an enormous amount of money, 100,000 ducats. And it's clear that this policy, once again, which had its reasons in war, questioned the balance between economic and political power and gave rise to several tensions within the patriciate. As regards the entry of the procurators, such tensions emerged from the sumptuary laws promulgated by the competent authorities, the Provveditoria alle Pompe. In 1683, a petition was addressed to the Signoria denouncing the luxurious decorations of the mercerie as detrimental to the republican values. A law in this regard was indeed voted and aimed at marking the entry of the procurators much more sober. The fleets of boats escorting the elected to the fondaco, as well as the portraits hanging on the mercerie, were formally forbidden. The prohibition was reiterated 7 times between 1687 and 1692, but was actually ignored. The most lavish entries date precisely to these years, and they were organized in spite of all these sumptuary laws. And here I have just a few examples to conclude. This is not the right. Here we are. According to the festival book by Michelangelo Mariani, L'ingresso trionfale dell'illustre ed eccellentissimo signor Leonardo Donato, 4 huge portraits of Procurator Leonardo Donato were put on display during his entry in 1688. The first painting portraying the Procuratore on horseback hung in Campo San Bartolomeo at the beginning of the ceremonial route. The second was at the end of the Mercerie, on the back of St. Mark's clock tower. The third hung in the piazza, and the fourth, which was even bigger, stood over the entrance of the Procuratie. Even the purchase of the office could become a source of literary pride. At the title of a booklet printed in 1690 for Procurator Sebastiano Soranzo, L'oro divenuto più glorioso del merito, the gold made more glorious than the merit, confirms that 17th century wit did not flinch from such paradoxical topos. More generally, all these texts are hyperbolic, both in terms of quantity, there are many texts and they are often long-winded, and quality, for their pages constantly move towards figures of augmentation as anaphora and iteration. Authors increase their rhetorical devices, multiplying the metaphors and the classical exempla to reflect the luxury of the performance. My point is that after the end of the Renaissance, Venetian Republican imagery radically changed, mirroring an evolving society. Both the economic context and the political arena were quite different from the 16th century. Therefore, new rhetorical strategies proved to be necessary to support government decisions and to glorify those responsible for them. The new importance accorded to public luxury was one of the consequences. Civic ritual was clearly affected, and festival become even more lavish and spectacular. The entry of the Procurator of St. Mark is a remarkable example of this process, because the ritual was actually expanded. There is more, however, than a mere shift in scale. This transformation primarily concerned the ways in which the body politic of the Republic was represented. The Myth of Venice depicted the patriciate as an estate regulated by clockwork mechanisms. All patricians were equal before the law, and only the Doge was considered a primus inter pares. While welcoming a foreign ruler or performing a ritual procession, the Doge did not act for himself, not for his house, but he rather embodied the whole patriciate, the Maggior Consiglio. For this reason, he was the only exception to the rule. However, things gradually changed after the 1630s, when several treatises spreading within the nobility, both prints and manuscripts, openly contested the myth. These texts criticized the wide-ranging influence exerted on Venetian politics by a few prominent casate, and countered the countless literary and artistic works extolling the members of these houses. The Myth of Venice simply could not bear the new protagonism of the grandi, of the most wealthy and influential patricians. And here I have my last slide showing an example from the first festival book printed for this quite exceptional leader, Giovanni Pesaro, in 1641. Such luxury was not intended to celebrate the Republic, not the patriciate as a whole. A value that could not belong to the myth of Venice, splendor rather applies to the single procurator and to his house. A good example in literary terms of this rhetorical scheme, which breaks ties with 16th century Republican imagery, are the Apparati Veneti published by Domenico Vincenti. Before narrating the entry of Giovanni Pesaro, as well as the rejoicings that accompanied the main event, Vincenti outlines the procurator's career in what looks like a short political treatise. Indeed, as professed at the beginning of the book, the topic should be the virtuous relationship between Republican values and elective offices. For holding the office of procurator, per merito, of course, in the Serenissima, is the reward, and I quote from the original text, a life living heroically, working hard for the common good. Here we are apparently in the field of Skinner's theory about the value of common good in celebrating Republican figures. According to the text, Pesaro does not owe his Sussex to a noble descent, but only to his merits. The Venetian institutions, working fairly and equally as usual, is the mechanization of virtue, have simply recognized Pesaro's merits. Indeed, however, Vincenti argues that Pesaro could have boasted about his blood, sangue, because his family is one of the most wealthy and powerful of Venice. But he did not. Now, this whole passage is a counterfactual conditional, built on a strong anaphora. Poteva, he could have, which is repeated 4 times. So the hypothesis to be discarded, that is to say, and I quote once again, Pesaro bragging about a family that has always been a site of magnificence, a school of religion, a remarkable scene of royal greatness, and a ever-shining glory of its republic. This hypothesis, which comes to name the royal greatness of Pesaro's family, is actually discussed in details and allows Vincenti to write a 4-page encomium of House Pesaro. Of course, even before the 17th century, the cult of the ancestors was a widespread phenomenon in Venice, and almost every palace had family portraits hanging in the portico, in the main room of the house. And in this respect, a text like this emphasizes a rather common approach. However, there is no denying that a sort of hero worship, unprecedented in the Republic iconography, raged in 17th century Venice. Public luxury, and the luxuries also in typography, as you can see, became a way of exhibiting private wealth and personal grandeur, and the celebration of the Republican office of procurator served as a pretext to celebrate the man who held it. This process actually reshaped the representation of the patriciate, and as the entry of the procurators of St. Mark witnesses, did reshape even the Republican ritual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Now we are going to have 10 minutes of pause, and after we back for the discussion, okay? Please at 6:10, okay? Thanks. A ver, no. Hola, 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 hola. No. Ahora perfetto, muchas gracias. Bueno, grazie tanti a tutte le due presentazioni. We are going to change to switch to the English, okay, my English, okay. But nevertheless, if somebody want to ask in Spanish or in Italian, we are open to that. We are in Europe, we can absolutely change, and if we need, we made some translation. That just first consideration before to open the floor to the people here are in the conference today. No, first of all, I think the excellent presentation, both of you, completely articulated between both, is really this mutual dialogue of the influence between republic and monarchy is absolutely innovative perspective, not so much, but okay, in some way we are doing and we're working against this binary opposition between monarchy and republic, liberty and absolutism and things like this. Both presentations show us that there is a real interpenetration between both models in this period, no, and mostly of all really that the Cambridge School theories are not really contextual, as they presume, but they are have sometimes forgotten that there is no just to analyze some text, but you have to also have a dialogue with other kind of sources that open you and contextualize really the position of the republics in this period. Because normally Skinner or Pocock, they use 3, 5 some text, typical published text, but with no dialogue with the facts, with the process, and you have shown with other kind of sources, and you also through, for instance, a spectacle for the festivals or the rituals are so interesting, and with this historical component, this diachronic component that you show very importantly in order to see the change are operating during the 16th and during the 17th century and even 18th century. Something we are working also in the case for the Spanish monarchy when we are analyzing this structure as a political imperial structure for urban republic, but also inside of this republic we are experimenting a very important change, and Domingo Centeno de Arce has a very interesting book, and he these towns pass from republic to noble towns, and they change a lot of elements of the representation of the civic festival, but at the same time the multiplication of this kind of civic festival in a number of spectacular more similar to this one you offer to Venice, not in the same degree, but with more related with religious elements, like for instance the exaltation of the Immacolata Concezione. There is very important festival in the second part of 17th century in order to show the body of the republic, but in a very more nobiliarian aristocratic way than during the 16th century. So we experiment some kind of changes inside of other towns also in the monarchical space, no? But something is interesting in your book, and in this thing I'm not really so sure I am agree with you in some element, because you establish something like a dialogue between, and it's true because in the case of Republicisti you can see this dialogue with Bodino, with all the absolutist text and the full sovereignty classic of absolutist text, but also they have a dialogue with other kind of things you have defined. For instance, Rivadeneira as an absolutist, I have some suspicion about he's not really an absolutist, and I think that is something that represents two models of representation for monarchy, very opposite and very in fight during the 16th and during the 17th century mostly. This more representative of the Habsburg model, and this one more represented by the French monarchy, but this French monarchy is influencing very strongly also inside of the Spanish monarchy, in the town of the Spanish monarchy. monarchy, and in Naples, in Milan, or in Brussels. But at the same time, at least the Habsburg model try all the time to show themselves like more respectuous for the mixed form of government against the tendency of absolutism of some kinds of republicanism. And I think, for instance, the case of the Dutch Republic, where the Republican Party, Thomas Meissen has a study, as you know, I think the work of Thomas Meissen is really a kind of absolutism, a Republican absolutism that was something new and was against the classical structure of the Republic, where the Prince of Orange represent this part of oligarchy, this kind of monarchy that was some mix that was more respectuous for the popular also, because the mixed model of government have this kind of representation of the popular for one plan, well, monarchical for the other, and the Republican. And in this sense, I think there is this kind of fight very important inside of the Republican position during this period, and there is a Republicanism more traditional and more respectuous with the status quo, and another one they want to try to change, imitating in the case of in Genoa, for instance, the model of Venice is incredible, because this myth of Genoa, even if you have shown this is more a myth than a reality, and provoking this tension also, for instance, in Swiss cantons, when there are the more poor and the more Catholic rural cantons are more in defense of to be protected under the emperor and maintain the representation, the symbol of the emperor in the sense to have an equilibrium against the more strong republican towns like Bernau, like Zurich, were very strong and are annulating this equilibrium that was the characteristic of this period. In this sense, I don't know what do you think about that, no? And for you, in your case, I think is really interesting to see how this increasing amount of festivals or representation and these festival books, no? You speak about 21 between 1648 and 1721, related with the War of Morea, but I think it's also maybe related also with this explosion of representation in the French monarchy, and that was very influential all over Europe, and Versailles and all this exaggerated representation. In this sense, there is also a strong dialogue with that. And another thing I think is interesting is to wondering about the relation between republics and empire, because one topic typical for the school, Cambridge School, is republicanism is in defense of freedom, but mostly is in defense of trade and is in defense in peace. No, is normally they maintain the peace because the peace is beneficial for the investment, but in reality, these republicans are really related with a very imperial and expansionist topos. And in the case of Venice, this component and this representation of the procuratores, or this status of the aristocrat in the towns, that means something related with this explosion. And I don't know, because at the same time, when the Venetians are doing this and are doing this spectacle and this representation, is the same period when Louis XIV tried to show to all Europe the independence of France vis-a-vis from the republics, no? Bombarding the big towns, I don't know, bombarding Genoa, bombarding Algiers, bombarding Barcelona, bombarding also Cartagena de Indias, bombarding Brussels, and trying to show really this autonomy, full and sovereign and plenty autonomy from that. No, in this sense, I don't know if you have found some dialogues on the model of representation of the festival, what's happening in the same period in France and that. And that is some of my consideration. Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know if there are some questions here. Somebody want to ask something? And you answer together to everybody? Natalia?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your conference. I was wondering because, I don't know a lot about the topic, but I love a book by Craig Callendorf, the Virgil and the Myth of Venice, in which he analyzed these ideas of Venice and the elites, of the self-image of Venetian elites, through the comments that they wrote on different editions of Virgil. And you have shown a lot of books, and also you have shown a lot of books about republicanism, and I wonder if you have any information about that, about the relationship of the readers, of the actual readers, with those books. If, I mean, it might be the news about people who really read those books, or what the readers wrote about those books, inside the books or outside. I mean, if you can elaborate a little bit more, because I'm really interested in that, the relationship between readers, the actual readers, and the construction of the ideas through readership. Thank you very much.
And also, you have some information about the circulation in Europe of this kind of book festival, ceremonial books. You have some about in library. Okay, that I think is also. More questions? Okay, you can answer.
Okay, I start from the last question then. Yeah, of course we have some information. I think this is an element that I would like to integrate in the next 2 years of the project, in the final period, and we are actively working on this. But for now, just saying what we know at that stage of our project, the first writing about the so-called anti-myth of Venice date back from the second half of the 17th century. We are not talking of publications because, of course, the Republic was very careful with this. We are mainly talking of manuscripts or comments to other books. So exactly what you are talking about. And the problem is well renowned and concerns the difference between rich and poor noblemen and all the phenomena that I described in this presentation. However, normally the standard working thesis about that is this contrast remains, manuscripts remains within the Collegio or the Maggior Consiglio, and they not exert an influence on Venetian culture. And this is the point I don't agree on, because I think that, for example, in civic ritual, but also in literature, you can actually see that this unsatisfaction with the situation of the patriciate is clearly directing new forms of representation. So yeah, we have this writing on the anti-myth. I think that there's much more, but of course to know that, as you are implying in your question, we should try to examine a large amount of books in libraries, in private libraries especially, and to do this we need time. It's something that we could not do, especially because of the pandemic, because there's, we talked about this, there's a member of the group, Gloria Moorman, who was hired precisely to develop a research on Venetian private collection, and she was hired in February 2020, right before the pandemic. But yeah, of course, thank you for your question, because it's a very important point. I completely agree. Something we do know about that. I think that more data are waiting for us, but we should still work on this. And then coming to your question, Manuel, thank you very much. But you said already everything, so I just have to confirm. Yeah, of course, here I think the two key elements in this explosion of the ritual here, I haven't the time to put the pieces together, so thank you very much for your question. And I wanted to show a well-focused case study in order to be consistent, especially because you are all historians, so it was a little bit scary. But yeah, I think that if we adopt a wider perspective, the main reasons for this are two. The relationship with France and with Louis XIV example, and here we have very specific examples. Once again, we recently talked about the globe that Morosini made realize to celebrate the new Venetian Empire. And of course, the one who produced this globe was Coronelli, who just came back from Paris, where he realized the famous globe for Louis XIV. This will be a chapter in one book we are working on. So this is perfect, and Morosini itself is a figure clearly looking at Louis XIV as the paradigm of the ruler. So the first reason is the relationship with France, and the second is the myth of the Eastern Mediterranean and the myth of the Venetian Empire. After Candia, Pesaro is the last one professing this myth. Apparently, this is over. The patriciate is really working on a much more modest perspective, and then the Battle of Vienna happens, and Morosini starts to conquer islands after islands. He attacked Athens. What about the city being bombarded, the Parthenon? He destroyed the Parthenon, Doge Francesco Morosini, in 1687, destroyed the Parthenon in order to conquer Athens. And of course, once again, I think he was really modeling his figure on Louis XIV. Then it's clear that Venice always keep a control on these forms of representation. Then many times we have just these materials manuscripts, they weren't printed, or in the case of Morosini, right after his death, laws are written specifying that this was an exceptional case. But in these years where Venice is really active on the military plan, conquering the Peloponnese and projecting this myth of a republican empire, which seemed anachronistic, but for, I don't know, 15, 12 years, seemed possible again. Well, in this period, I do think that the main model was Louis XIV's France, and I do think that the change was really modeled on this new representation of power made possible by the Sun King. So yeah, basically I just repeated what you said, but yeah, and I think one last thing. Sorry, I'm being a little bit wordy. Now our main challenge, as I said, is put together all these things. So Morosini as personal patron, great hero. This hero worship that does not depend from Morosini. The role played by Pesaro 40 years before as a possible model, as the first time in which a procurator made a book dedicated to himself and paid for it. So really try to better articulate this changing situation, but the key elements are all there. We just have to put them together, and I hope we will do this in the same articulated and precise way that, for now, I just have some case studies, but for example, also Arthur Weinstein is working on this, is working precisely on the Morosini's empire, and of course this cannot be defined an empire, but still there's this idea of military conquest, and yeah, nothing to do with the...
And for the Dutch case, somebody's studied that also for the Dutch case?
Yeah, Arthur is trying to compare the two. And of course it's really different, and that's a big part of the problem, because we are dealing with a colonial empire distributed in very far places, and this, of course, forces the Dutch Republic to elaborate a new set of ideas to justify and to describe this empire. While in the Venetian case is something that Venice had back in the 13th century, then he lost it. The Ottoman Empire seemed to be invincible, and after, once again, the Battle of Vienna for 20, 30 years, it seemed that this dream is possible again, but in a completely different framework, which is the framework of the Sun King. So what about a Doge regaining the empire, the old and prestigious Venetian Empire, and being compared, sometimes in a very clear way, to the Sun King? This is maybe the question at stake, but I don't have proper answer, as you see, but I have a lot to think about. Okay,
thank you very much, Manuel. your consideration were very, very interesting and gave me a lot of suggestion. And first of all, I totally agree with you. I should have made more clear distinction between what I call absolutist model, because of course Rivadeneira's treatise is something very different from Baudin, very different from Hobbes and Lipsius, and I think we can divide into these two different traditions of monarchical writing, one which is more reason of state absolutist and is Baudin and is Hobbes, and the other which is the Habsburg tradition, yes, which arrives until the 18th century and with the enlightened despotism and monarchy, as we want to call it. I think that in Genoa, at that time, what was interesting for a person like Ambrogio Spinola, who promoted the translation of this treatise, was to answer to a question that many of other Genoese noblemen wanted to answer. What should be the behavior of a man of government? And the man of government, the man who has the government, is the king. And so they read, obviously, with great curiosity, this kind of sources without posing the issue. Well, they give suggestion on the behavior of the king, on the behavior of the prince. We are in a republic, so we don't have the prince, so it's not suitable for our constitution. They just read their books because they think that it was very useful to develop a political elite. So these are two traditions that relevantly are receptive in the Republican context. And then there is a third political tradition that is not the republicanism, the new Roman republicanism, according to my opinion, of Cambridge, but is the republicanism that you have just mentioned. The idea that there is a network of republics that should help one another. There is something that will come back also in the years of the French Revolution, and very strongly, but existed also in this time, in the middle of 17th century, and in general is particularly relevant with the case, for example, of Veneroso, the highest moment of the Navalisti, of the Republicistis party, when Veneroso wrote a book, important position in the government, and suggests to help Venice in the War of Candia. He sent some help to Venice. He was celebrated in Venice too, and there is in that period all the idea that Genoa should imitate in somehow Venice, as you said, and this was really different from what happened in the past when they had commercial interest at stake, and so Venice and Genoa were a really strong enemy one of the other. And this time, this point, for according to my opinion, a very short period, we have this idea of a network of republics that should be collaborative and should help and be modeled one on the other, with strong presence, international presence, in a sort of alliance of republics. The problem is, according to my opinion, that this period is very short, and already in the second half of the 17th century, this is no more possible, because the Italian republics get into a political fall of the enthusiasm on the international scenario. They are no more protagonists, and in that period, they look outside for finding other models, other republican models. And what do they find? They found the only republic that, according to their opinion, solved the bigger problem that every historiographer in the second part of the 17th century say about republics. The problem of republics is that it's not very clear where the locus of sovereignty is. No. If you are in a monarchy, the sovereignty is in the hand of the king, this is clear, and the king has to decide. He can be a tyrant or he can be a good father, but he has to decide, to take decision. If we are in a republic, a lot of people can decide, and you don't know very well who has the last word. And so they try to look to another model, and the model they found is that of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic with the strong presence of the Prince of Orange. Even if in those years, maybe the Prince of Orange was at the it hasn't the strength, the political strength that it had a couple of decades before. So it's really complex. It's I think a sort of path between these three traditions, and I think that from this atmosphere, from this framework, the neo-Roman republican is something that completely lacks. I don't know if you are agree.
No, I agree. But nevertheless, if you think finally, okay, if you realize, for instance, the Genoese republicists, they try to imitate and have this international of republicanism, but finally the Dutch Republic destroy all the companies, destroy what the things, the penetration in Asia was completely aggressive against them, and the same happened finally between the Venice and the Dutch. They have this theoretical union, but finally they never worked really, and finally it was the Habsburg, the defender of the republics in this context of the position of this kind of organization. So I think yes, it's very interesting the 17th for this change and for this dialogue is inside that, and it's curious also because if you think it's true that the Spanish monarchy maintained this very strong alliance with more oligarchical groups inside of the both republic, in the Dutch Republic and also in Genoa, for instance. But at the same time, finally, this oligarchical group tried to emancipate of the dependence of the Spanish in one case, or in another case from the Prince of Orange, was the former enemy of the Spanish monarchy, and finally was an ally of the Spanish monarchy because no getting sovereign, maintaining this form of republicanism that was this kind of republicanism that the Spanish monarchy has inside of these territories, happening in Naples, happening in Milano, happening in the Castilian towns, and even in the American towns. This strong autonomy of the towns, this strong links, so it's complicated in this sense, because the aggressivity of, for instance, the most Tacitian of all of us, Saavedra Fajardo, who best can know very, very well, and is very influential, for instance, in the Lacour brothers, the Republicanist, because he's against the Prince of Orange, but at the same time, Saavedra Fajardo is very aggressive against this concentration of power in the hands of the oligarchs at the same time, because, and there is always trying to show an excessive tendency of luxury elements for these sectors of the oligarchy of Venice or of Genoa will be really a venin introduced by the French and destroying the Republicans' values. And he told the Spanish ambassadors and the Spanish world maintain always this severity, this modesty, this blackness, nothing related with this exaggeration of the French. And these elements were very, very important. He tried to tell them, be careful, France is introducing all these luxurious elements, and of course, sitting the Caton's laws and all these kinds of elements that corrupt also Roman. So France is getting something like these sumptuarian laws and all these things happen also inside of Spain. No, it's dangerous because that is a corruption, and that is terrible for the morality of the towns and the modesty of the governors. And these things is always happening, and that's happening in the Republic of Genoa, and the Spanish monarchy has always very good feeling with, and there is a lot of literature telling, okay, the popular sector think they live better in a monarchy than in a republic and in an aristocratic republic, and it's a classical that, no, because it's very difficult to promote himself inside of a republic very, very close. If you want to promote and have a social ascension, is easier in a monarchy when you have the power of the king who can to help you, that in this kind of very close and very narrow republic. So there is very strong contradiction, but at the same time, I think the only thing is a strong interdependence between both models, because the things happen in these republics are happening also in France. In the front, there is a lot of attack against that, no, and against these models of aristocratic. So I think is an error to separate what's happening in the republics and just thinking about the rhetoric of some kind of writers and republicistas and all these kind of people. And finally, these things happen also in the monarchies and happening. And there is very, very strong differences between the monarchies, the model of monarchical power in Europe. The Habsburgs and Bourbons are completely opposite in this sense. But okay. I don't know, you want to tell something?
Maybe
Yeah?
I forgot to answer to your, I don't want to steal the time, but I forgot to answer to your second question about the circulation of these festival books. I just forgot. And once again, it's really interesting because here, the main scholarly paradigm is the one of the repudiation of ritual in 17th century Europe. I'm thinking of Peter Burke, but other scholars also, Edward Muir. So once again, the idea is it's more interesting to study 13 and 16, so 16th century festival books because they are describing events that were more important in political life at the time. Now, I'm not interested in this thesis. Maybe it's true, of course, that in the 17th century they did not believe in the sensa like they did in the Middle Ages, but it's not really interesting from a scientific point of view. What is interesting is that we had this book, these books being produced, being printed, and of course the tradition of the festival book as a genre is a tradition that's ambiguous, that's an hybridation of forms, because we have two big models. The festival books for the King of France, so the Sacre, the Joyeuse Entrée, and so on, and we have the one printed in let's say, it's complicated because before, of course, in Burgundy, but right after, from the city, from the southern Netherlands, to be clear, and there, of course, the genre of the festival book is more the Republican tool because it's a local community representing itself in negotiating their role with the ruler.
With 40s is against this kind of entering the towns.
Yeah. So once again, the festival book in Venice. Of course, we have big, magnificent festival books printed to honor the entry of Henry III of France or other princes, also in the 17th century. But we also have this kind of literary products being printed from a party or a single patriciate in order to defend a position and to project an image. Here we have the Grandi trying to demonstrate their new role they have, and they are using the same typographical resources that we find in France at that time. So once again, if we consider these literary products as in their materiality as books being printed and produced in a certain time according to a certain rhetoric, we see that there are links that they did not depend on the repudiation of ritual or in the power that the ritual, but it's more about politics and the fight between different positions within the community itself, within the politics. So I think it was a very ambiguous resource. It had a strong tradition. It can be used in many different ways, and that's what makes festival books so interesting in my view.
In the 18th century, they continued to publish that, the second part of 18th century?
Not really. Till the half of the century, yeah. I'm sure of it. In the second half, it's a little bit more complicated because there maybe the paradigm of Venice as the carnival city, yeah. The big festivals without meanings or purpose, I don't say it's true. It's a little bit more truer. I don't know. I mean, what I want to say is that, yeah, we have festival books also in the second part of the 18th century. I don't know them so well, but the idea I got is really about a sort of big celebration of whatever happens. A lot of princes, of course, and rulers come to Venice, but these are not official visits. Henry III in France in 1574 came for an official visit, came as the King of France. Peter of Russia did not just arrive in Venice to look, at the ships, and was like, they call him the famous traveler, and a festival book was realized to describe the regatta they held in his honor, but of course there was not a political purpose, not that clear at least.
Is okay? No more question? Okay, thank you very much, both of you. Okay. We're going to close here. Okay. It's okay. Yes, because we have to leave at 7. Dobbiamo finire alle 7, sì, perché questi signori lavorano.